The United States' strategy to try and defeat the Soviet Union, and now China, is containment. In medicine, containment means the isolation of a virus so that it cannot spread, infect, and harm others. In geopolitics, containment has a very similar meaning. The idea of containment of the Soviet Union came from George Kennan in an article that he wrote in December 1946. Yet the kind of containment that was actually implemented against the Soviet Union and now against China is very different from what George Kennan had in mind. And this reveals something very important about how politicians think. But let's look at Kennan's version of containment first. So writing in 1946, Kennan understood that the Soviet Union was in no shape for another war. The losses during World War II were appalling, and the Russian people wanted and they needed peace. There was no military threat coming from Moscow, Kennan realized, but there was a political and ideological threat, and here is where containment came into play. According to Kennan, in those early years after World War II, Europe and Japan were unstable. They were in the process of reconstruction and people were still in shock, they were feeling uncertain and vulnerable. As such, they could be attracted to communism, which at that time had a well-organized movement behind it. Not only did communism provide an alternative to the Western system, a system which in the eyes of many had been responsible for the war, but the Soviet Union itself also had emerged from the war with great prestige for its successful war effort. All in all, in those early years after World War II, communism had its appeal to many people. Now, Kennan's nightmare scenario was that, with Moscow's encouragement and support, communist parties would take power in Europe, for example in Italy and France, or in Japan. If that were to happen, they would fall under Moscow's influence and control, Kennan believed. And this, he writes, would be a defeat for us, fully as serious as would have been a German victory in the war that had just ended. Now, although during the last years of World War II the United States had not protested when Soviet armies overran and took control of Eastern Europe, in 1946, at the time when Kennan wrote his articles, he believed the United States should no longer make these kinds of concessions to Moscow. Washington, he writes, should make it clear to Moscow that they are not going to be allowed to establish any dominant influence in Western Europe and in Japan. And this is what Kennan meant by containment. Now, Kennan believed containment should be a long-term strategy, and he had reasons to think in this way. The communist leadership, he argued, believes that capitalism is a problematic system that will ultimately self-destruct. So the Soviets, in their quest to defeat capitalism, they believe that time is on their side, and as such they can afford it to be patient, to temporarily retreat if they feel that's necessary, and to not risk failure by acting too quickly. And this makes them dangerous, Kennan argued, and the United States should counter it with long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment. Now, about how the United States should go about it, Kennan had many ideas. In both his long telegram and the famous X article, however, he does not mention anything about a military form of containment. Kennan does not talk about anti-Soviet military alliances. He does not talk about surrounding the Soviet Union with military bases. He does not mention the need to further develop nuclear weapons. Kennan even states he even says that there is no need for threats or blustering or superfluous gestures of outward toughness. So he actually believed that intimidations and threats coming from Western politicians can become counterproductive, because a leadership that feels bullied and intimidated may feel the need to act more aggressively, which can then lead to unnecessary escalation and conflict. So instead, in dealing with the Soviet Union, US leaders should be cool and collected, he writes, and only put demands on the other side that are reasonable and leave room for agreement and negotiation. So instead of taking an aggressive approach, Kennan proposed that the United States instead should demonstrate to the world the benefits of its own values, its ability to solve problems, and the strength and the determination to provide security to those in need. Now, why? To show to everyone that communism is not an attractive ideology or a system. If done successfully, Kennan believes, the peoples and nations of the world would rally around the United States, and the spread of communism becomes impossible. Containment, in other words. So Kennan wanted the United States to shine, to show what a great country it is and what wonderful things it could offer humanity. In a way, Kennan even argued, they should be grateful for the presence of the Soviet Union and the political threat that it is, because it gave Americans a great opportunity to become a better nation. Now, unfortunately for Kennan, his ideas of containment were never implemented. People in Washington were not open to these ideas. Because in a way, Kennan committed the ultimate sin. When you're in the face of a strong rival or enemy, you are not supposed to criticize your own group. You have to be a cheerleader for whatever your own group does. And you have to focus all your criticism on the other side. So that is why the United States leadership, they didn't like Kennan's ideas on how to implement containment. And instead, they took it in a very different direction. So here comes perhaps the most important Cold War document, NSC68, which is a report from the US National Security Council to the President, written in the early months of 1950. So by that time, George Kennan had lost his influence inside the US government. People felt that Kennan's ideas were too peaceful and were out of place. And Kennan's successor, a man called Paul Nietzsche, took a very different approach on how to contain the Soviet Union. So Nietzsche, like many others around him, believed in a military solution, and NSC68 was their creation. So if you read the report, what you see is that the authors identify 4 possible courses of action for the United States on how to deal with the Soviet Union. And the one that they choose, the one that they advocate, is to increase positions of strength, especially military power. Now, NSC68 is interesting in many different ways. For one, it is a very hysterical document. It describes a black and white fantasy world in which pure good, the United States, confronts pure evil, the Soviet Union. So the report begins by stating that the fundamental purpose of the United States is all about justice, liberty, democracy, and promoting general welfare all around the world. Now, opposed to the United States stands the Soviet Union. And contrary to the peaceful nature of the free world and the United States, the Kremlin has designs for world domination, a world dominated by its will, and only the US world leadership can prevent the Kremlin from doing its evil work. Now, Moscow's intent on world domination is mentioned 17 times in the document. So, having set the scene for a confrontation with the evil empire, the document then highlights what the US response should be: building up the strength of the free world, more specifically military strength. The word strength is mentioned 93 times in the report. Nietzsche and his colleagues come up with their recommendations. The first mention is the military, and here they reveal exactly what they have in mind. So, to quote from the report, the United States needs a build-up of military strength to provide an adequate defense against air attack on the United States and Canada, and an adequate defense against air and surface attack on the United Kingdom and Western Europe, Alaska, the Western Pacific, Africa, and the Near and Middle East, and on the long lines of communication to these areas. So what this means is that Nietzsche and his friends, what they want is for the United States to completely encircle the Soviet Union, from Europe to Africa, the Middle East, Asia, the Western Pacific, all the way up to Alaska, in order to contain the Soviet Union, to prevent it from influencing other countries around the world. So it is a military containment, the complete isolation of the Soviet Union, which will be surrounded by US military installations and military alliances in a complete noose around the Soviet Union. What NSC68 represents is just a shift in what containment means. So Kennan wanted the United States to show to the world its greatness. Now, the greatness of its economic system, of its culture, its values, in order to rally countries around the world to its side, and in doing so to prevent them from feeling attracted to Soviet communism. Kennan wanted to prevent military escalation because he believed it would only make it more difficult for the two sides to exist together peacefully. Now, unfortunately for Kennan, most politicians were and still are not open to such more nuanced ideas. They, like Nietzsche, they like to think in terms of strength and military power. So Kennan in the late 1940s was removed, and people like Nietzsche took over, and containment became a military strategy. Containment became a goal in itself, not a means to an end like Kennan would have wanted. Kennan wanted containment to ultimately lead to a negotiated agreement between the West and the Soviet Union on how they could live together. To Nietzsche and his supporters, containment itself was the goal, and it was a military form of containment. So they set out to encircle Russia and the Soviet Union with US military forces in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, and many other places. They created the anti-Soviet military alliance, NATO, and they further developed their nuclear weapons, all of which Kennan was against. A negotiated peace was thus out of the question. The Soviet Union had to be completely isolated and surrounded. Only then would the world be safe. Naturally, the Soviet Union responded with a military buildup of its own, and before long, both superpowers were involved in the most dangerous arms race the world had ever seen.